Hey, this is Chris Wink, the CEO of Technically, ahead of the 10th annual Philly Tech Week presented by Comcast and our annual Introduced conference, having a series of conversations with smart people reporting on and working in the economy. And today I'm joined by John Fortt, who's a CNBC co-anchor for Squawk Alley. He also has a brand called Fortt Knox. I love that brand, John. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Chris.
I appreciate it. So you've got a great reporting pedigree. I want to start off and kind of dive right into conversations here. I'm thinking most prominently in 2020, we have a lot of surging tech companies particularly, but also big brands, as often happen during recessions. At the same time, we have tens of millions of people unemployed. What does a two-sided economic recovery mean? Meaning happening real fast for some and real slow for others. What's the consequences and what should we be looking out for?
Chris, it means if you had a lot of money already, you're probably okay. It's all about capital, right? So big companies that had a lot of money or had a lot of assets that they could leverage during this time have found ways to get funding to keep operating. And in some cases, if they were really well positioned, say technology firms that had cloud operations, cloud tools, they're doing even better than they would be under normal circumstances. Because I think part of what's happened is there were a bunch of businesses out there that were trying to run a sort of mainstream brick and mortar business and run an online operation at the same time. And they wanted to move to digital, but they had to do that while keeping the mainstream thing going. And then COVID hits and your brick and mortar, just that business goes away. And you've got to shift to digital to survive. So they shifted all these resources to keep the lights on, keep the customers served, to digital, omni-channel, and e-commerce operations. And some of the businesses that were well positioned there, your Amazons, your Walmarts, your Targets, your Adobes, Apple, on down the line, they are doing quite well.
So, actually, to jump, because you're hitting on something that for 10 years we've been reporting on. Despite the narrative, entrepreneurship has been declining since the 70s in the United States. The millennial generation is the least entrepreneurial of any American generation. It's a lot of reasons. We know corporate consolidation and the like goes into that. But every recession usually tends to, with a couple exceptions, usually reduce the number of smaller firms. I think a lot about this as, do we just inevitably go to 5 companies, as is often the joke? Are we on just a decades-long pathway to the most efficient economy we can have? Or is there a bottom? Is there a point where we're going to maintain some level of new incorporation and churn? Are you thinking about that? Does that come up in your own reporting?
Yeah, I do think about that. And no, we're not going to 5 companies. That's not going to happen. And
good.
That's very good. I do work for a rather large company, but I don't think it's good for the country, for the world, if we end up in that kind of a scenario. For example, so a couple of weeks ago, we saw this company, Snowflake, go public. And most people have never heard of Snowflake. This is a company that deals in data storage, cloud technology. This is not one of those big 5 public companies. It was a startup.
Shout out. Because there's probably many Snowflake employees at Introduced, actually, this conference right now watching. So yes, Snowflake is well represented here.
Shout out to Frank Slipman and the gang. The argument was out there. Okay, there are these companies, just a few companies dominating the cloud, and then you have this company go public at a 60 billion plus market cap. If it was a monopoly, then somebody should have told, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, who I'm sure would love to have the value that Snowflake represents. So, that's a big example, but there are plenty of other smaller companies. I recently interviewed the CEO and founder of a company, Kindbody, Gina Bartesi. She's on her 5th startup. That company focuses on fertility and using technology to lower the cost of fertility treatments. I think that there's probably certain classes of entrepreneurial startups and smaller businesses that just aren't as viable as they were, 30, 40 years ago. But there are whole new possibilities of the types of businesses that can be started. There are certain types of businesses that are really thriving. And I think it's taking a while for the American entrepreneur and small business community to figure out the right playbooks, but I believe it'll happen.
Technology, particularly like scalable software solutions, fit in this narrative that the Kauffman Foundation, shout out to them, does considerable reminding that they want us to separate out the idea of small business and new business. That Kauffman Foundation is a lot of research that economic growth tends to happen with new business. We're 20 employees, but we're a news organization. We're not going to be 1,000 employees tomorrow. We're not a rocket ship. We're a small business. Kauffman notes that we're not going to do a lot of wealth creation. We're not going to create 1,000 new jobs. It's newer firms, usually firms that are under 3 years old. That tension for me is interesting. And I wonder if we will go to an era in which we will have next to very few of the small business, characterized often as the restaurant, which we know we are in a heck of a time right now for restaurants. But we might focus on this destination of entrepreneurship that is, go for a home run. If you get to growth, great. If you don't, it might be difficult to sustain. Does that kind of land at all for you or resonate? Or
again, I hope that's not where we end up, and I don't think it's where we end up. Because first of all, I feel like I need to give you a pep talk. Like, you might only be 20.
Please,
people,
it's 2020. I need the pep talk. It's 2020, man. I need
what
it.
Can happen. I think there are a lot of small new businesses that at first think maybe this is all there is, but then they end up becoming something huge. I remember, talking to Toby Lutka, who's a guy who started Shopify. Originally, he was trying to start an e-commerce site for selling snowboards. Not that he thought it was going to be small, but you don't end up with $100 billion market cap for a snowboard e-commerce site. So he's building it for that. And then, the snow melts and he realizes that nobody buys snowboards when it's not snowing, and tries to figure out what to do. It turns out he had built the site for that, and other people wanted to buy the technology. And he decided, well, rather than give them the code, I'm going to sell it software as a service. Boom, Shopify's born, huge Amazon competitor, et cetera. So I think what looks like a small business might really be a new business with scale potential. So there's that. And also in the gig economy and some other things happening right now, individuals become small businesses a lot more easily than they used to. And there are platforms like Intuit that are trying to make it easier for people to LegalZoom, trying to make it easier for individual entrepreneurs to operate at a smaller scale. And I think so you'll end up maybe with more super small businesses that are 1 or 2 people, and you'll end up with small businesses that are destined to stay small, and you'll end up with those new businesses that you're talking about, and you'll end up with small businesses that end up scaling even if they didn't look like they were going to begin with. But the key is that flexibility and the use of technology to be able to go from one stage to another.
Yeah, I like this idea that just what we understand to be entrepreneurship has changed, because in a lot of that research, it's the mom and pop dry cleaner is changing. Like that transforms. You tend to see fewer examples of started as a family business and stayed, though that rate is declining. More Americans work at firms that are 250 employees or more than at smaller firms. And that was a change that just happened in the last decade for the first time, that we work more at larger firms than smaller ones. That thanks for the pep talk. I appreciate that. I wrestle with what do we even want? Because I think you're also alluding to something. There's a cold calculating view of economics of we are meant to just continue to go toward ever more efficient models. And at some point, larger firms offer some scale, but we tend to find both innovation, approaching things entirely differently, and in sheer wanting your main street to not look the same as every other, we still have a very traditional hold. How much can that traditional hold fight back big economic, macroeconomic trends? Put another way, if we're going to see 1 in 6 restaurants disappear in 2020, does some version of Main Street come back because we want it to, or is that just a relic of a past that we're going to dispose of?
I don't know. I think, though, what's inherent in your question is the possibility of these countervailing forces I think we tend to forget about. Like I remember back in the 90s, when I was in high school and college, there was this talk about Walmart is going to completely swallow retail. I went to college in a small town, Greencastle, Indiana, DePaul University, and like the big thing to do, the pilgrimage, the retail pilgrimage you would make is to the Walmart because you could get everything for your dorm room there, et cetera. And the downtown in this rural, Putnam County town had been kind of gutted by many different trends, but the presence of a Walmart didn't help. And then at the time, everybody was talking, oh, well, Walmart's running away with it. Nobody's ever going to be bigger than Walmart. But now we're talking about, is Amazon a monopoly? It's like, hello, Walmart's still there. I mean, granted, it's a $350 billion market cap, and Amazon's like 1.5 trillion, which tells you where people think, at least investors think the value is. But there are all these countervailing forces. Now you've got Walmart still in the game versus Amazon. You've got Shopify that's empowering smaller businesses with some of those same tools to provide some effects of scale technologically to companies that don't have scale in the traditional sense in people and some of those other capital resources. I think that's interesting. I also think the power of certain platforms like DoorDash. And I'm going to keep plugging Fortt Knox here, connect to it on LinkedIn. It's kind of my digital brand. I talked to Tony Xu, one of the co-founders there, the CEO there, about their platform. They started out in food delivery, and now they're moving into like grocery and goods delivery. And that provides some of this on-ramp to small business and cash generation that I think we're talking about. People who might have worked in a restaurant or done odd jobs as they're working their way through school have an opportunity to do this kind of thing. And if they get the right kind of efficient, maybe they come out a bit ahead. Those are on-ramps that help people start businesses, that help people get going. Even Amazon, right? Big, huge business. They've got this delivery model that's trying to rely on contractors and perhaps enable small business creation that way. I think eventually the best entrepreneurs figure out ways, even if it's not what the big company intended, to create their own niche business that could scale and give them their own benefit.
I like that. I want to turn a touch here to like issue-based advocacy from companies. This is a big generational change for sure. It's not the CEO that donates to a presidential candidate quietly in behind the scenes. This is now both in issue-based issues, climate change, Black Lives Matter, racial equity, differently probably than purely political issues, which I think is almost like it's a different category. These like pure, gosh, somebody's got to say something things, setting aside pure politics. Is this something that you see as a trend to stay? Are we in a moment in time, or is this a big generational shift that will expect companies to make these kinds of, where do you stand on climate change? Is this something that you're meaningfully addressing, or is it an afterthought?
I think it's here to stay. I think, though, that as journalists, as consumers, we need to look at these corporate stances always with some skepticism, because I think values mean something different to companies than they do to people. For some companies, values are marketing vehicles as much as they are strongly held beliefs. And as we see their behaviors over time, both externally and internally, we get to separate perhaps what's a marketing message from what's a belief. So, a company might talk a lot, or even put out messages, or even donate big amounts of money promoting the idea of diversity. But then look at their board, look at their leadership, look at who's getting promoted, look at the employee base, and see, is that really a value that runs all the way through the company, or is it something that they feel like they have to express? And I think there's a level of intelligence and discernment that's required in this time about those issues and those topics, and it's required at the consumer and citizen level. It's certainly required as much as ever. It's always been required at the journalistic level, because there is this term virtue signaling, and I think what that means is marketing more than actually deeply practiced belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it's no better exemplified in 2020, though 2020 has been full of these examples, but no better than the black square Tuesday, black tile Tuesday, the idea of throwing up a black tile 3 days after the horrific killing of George Floyd to kind of say you stand for BLM, Black Lives Matter, and then looking, as you said, across boards and task forces, and there's next to no action. The fundamental core economic principle that belies hundreds of years of oppression often comes back to both an income and wealth inequality gap we have starkly seen in racial disparity. I wonder, in your reporting, this is something that we technically care a lot about, do a considerable amount of reporting. Are you seeing any bright lights in this change of Black wealth creation? And I'll note, as some ample technically reporting is done, I'll put a link in the bio, 50 years out after a great decade of progress in the 60s, we've seen very little progress in racial wealth and income inequality differences. Do you see any bright lights now? Are you optimistic? Is the next 50 years have any chance of being more progress than the last 50?
Always. There's always that chance. So when I say I'm optimistic, I say that from the perspective of we live in hope, right? And in understanding that every day and every moment, each person, each organization gets to develop and then make a set of choices that absolutely can make a profound difference. You know, there's a lot of talk right now about, well, I like to focus on equality of opportunity versus trying to control equality of outcomes. And so my belief, kind of as a business journalist who looks at this and covers this, is that it seems to be and seems to make sense that a national economy does best when every individual person in it has the opportunity to reach and express the full level of their talent and potential. You know, so if you can learn as much as your innate ability will allow, and then work as hard as you can work, you know, hustle as hard as you can hustle, that's good for the whole economy, because you'll start a business or, you know, and hire lots of people, or perform really well and cause your company's stock to go up, you know, whatever. Everybody reaches their full potential. That's good. But we look at the data and we see that that's not happening. And if we see that the outcomes aren't equal, then we got to ask, are there barriers in place in our society that are keeping certain groups of people from having the opportunity to reach their full potential? And if so, it makes sense, whether you're a liberal, conservative, whatever, to remove those barriers so people got a chance. That doesn't mean you're going to get an equal outcome. It just means, okay, everybody get equally prepared to the greatest degree possible, and then, you know, do the best you can. And that's good for everyone. I do think that we're seeing some focus on these issues now, and that's good. I don't think we are yet seeing the depth and length of commitment to these issues from the companies, from the institutions that have the power and influence to focus our attention. That makes me convinced that this is the start of this moment where everything's different from here. You know, let's see. Let's give it a few months. Let's get past, you know, 2020 into 2021, see how much everybody's still talking about this. See if people are replenishing these funds that they're talking about, where they're going to focus on gender equality, you know, racial equality, finding pools of talent that they otherwise haven't tapped into. Are they still going back to their own alma maters? Are they tapping into different networks where there are talented people who have high potential? Let's see if this thing has legs. But I do think that for the entire American economy, that equality of opportunity issue is absolutely key.
Well said. A couple last points before I let you go. One that comes to my mind a lot, and it touches on what we said a moment ago here. Recessions tend to be bad for small business. We like the story of Uber and Airbnb came out of the Great Recession. They tend to be the exceptions. We see rates of both incorporation and number of businesses decline, particularly small businesses. Maybe put a little bit differently, our federal government did on a global scale pretty enormous fiscal stimulus, outpacing a whole lot of other countries. How do you view fiscal stimulus so far, particularly in the small business lens, how would you grade it, and how important is it? Is this a misuse of funds because we should just let those 5 companies run the world? You're telling me it's a very pessimistic view. So,
well, I think this is a different question. About how small business is affected by this, to some degree, government-created recession. Right? It wasn't going to be good when a pandemic hits, no matter what. But the shutdown that came as a result of that was a decision that government made, which makes this recession very weird and different in that sense. I think stimulus. Most people agree that stimulus itself is needed. I think most people would also agree that stimulus benefited big businesses a lot more than it's benefited the breadth of small businesses. And part of that is, I think, a structural issue where just big businesses have a seat at the table. They figure out ways to get the resources. It reminds me of growing up, junior high, high school, et cetera. I had a cat named Cleo, and Cleo was super sweet, except when there was another cat around, because she was used to being the only one. And at this one point, she was staying in a place with this other cat, and she would eat her food and the other cat's food and be like, hey, stay away. And big business can be kind of like that. There's a pool of money for small business, and you get all these big businesses that are in there eating the food. It's like, wait, this isn't for you. Why are you in that bowl? Well, they figure out, well, we got a bunch of small locations, so they can get in there. So I think in that sense, when you get a big pool of money, there's going to be inefficiency. There's going to be waste, but we're better than this, right? With the technological tools that we have, with databases, artificial intelligence, with a certain level of thoroughness and intent, I believe the government could get better at targeting small business. Clearly, they haven't.
Be real with me, John. How often does Cleo make appearances on Fortt Knox?
Never. I mean, this is a cat I had in junior high. It's a sad story. I had to give her away in college. Well, after college, because a roommate that I had to stay with had allergies. So on the one hand, I never had to say goodbye to Cleo from this earthly realm. But on the other, I'm sure, cats tend not to live beyond 20 years. So I'm sure she's in a better place with a bowl of her own.
So you're telling me I can count Cleo as a technically exclusive. That's what I hear you saying to me.
Yes, I've never mentioned Cleo before on any stream or on broadcast television. Yeah,
you heard it here first. John, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. Make sure to check him out on CNBC's Squawk Alley and Fortt Knox, both LinkedIn and elsewhere on social. He's a great follow on Twitter. Thanks again, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.